The 42nd floor of Blackwood Technologies hummed with quiet efficiency. But beneath the polished surface lay an unspoken rule that every employee knew by heart. Julian Blackwood, the 34-year-old tech billionaire who had built his empire from nothing, never touched women. Not a handshake, not an accidental brush, nothing. The whispers followed him through glass corridors. Speculation about trauma or eccentricity, but no one dared ask the man himself. Julian stood at his office window, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a circuit board. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccable, but his gray eyes held a coldness that made even seasoned executives nervous. He had built Blackwood Technologies into a global powerhouse through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to predict market trends. Yet for all his success, he remained an enigma wrapped in expensive fabric and emotional barriers. "Mr. Blackwood?" His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your new personal assistant is here for her first day." Julian's jaw tightened slightly. He had gone through 17 personal assistants in 2 years. They either quit in frustration at his demanding nature or made the mistake of trying to get too close. He expected this one would last perhaps 3 weeks. "Send her in," he replied, without turning from the window. The door opened with a soft click, and Julian heard confident footsteps on the marble floor. When he finally turned around, he found himself looking at a woman who seemed entirely unbothered by his intimidating reputation. Sophia Chen stood there, with a warm smile, her long black hair pulled back in a professional bun, wearing a navy blazer that somehow managed to look both businesslike and approachable. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that caught him off guard. "I'm Sophia Chen. I'm excited to work with you." Julian studied her for a moment. Most people wilted under his direct gaze, but Sophia met his eyes steadily, as if she were genuinely pleased to be there rather than terrified. It was unsettling. "Have you been briefed on the requirements of this position?" he asked, his tone deliberately cold. "Extensive travel, irregular hours, complete discretion, the ability to anticipate your needs before you voice them," Sophia recited with that same easy smile. "Also, I understand you prefer to maintain professional boundaries." That was the polite way of saying he was notorious for being untouchable. Julian nodded curtly. "Good. Your first task is to organize my schedule for the upcoming board meeting. Everything needs to be perfect." "Of course," Sophia replied, then tilted her head slightly. "Should I coordinate with catering as well? I notice you often work through lunch." Julian blinked. How could she possibly know that already? "Yes," he said after a pause. "Light meals, nothing elaborate." As Sophia turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Blackwood? I know this might sound presumptuous on my first day, but you look like you haven't slept well in weeks. Maybe I could arrange for better coffee to be delivered to your office? Good stuff tends to help." Julian stared at her, completely taken aback. No one had spoken to him so directly about his personal well-being in years. Most people were too intimidated or too focused on advancing their own careers to notice such things. "That won't be necessary," he said stiffly. Sophia shrugged good-naturedly. "Well, the offer stands if you change your mind." After she left, Julian found himself staring at the closed door for several minutes. There was something different about Sophia Chen. Something that made his carefully constructed walls feel suddenly less secure. Over the next few days, Sophia proved herself to be remarkably capable. She anticipated his needs with uncanny accuracy, managed his impossible schedule with grace, and somehow made the office feel less like a sterile corporate environment. She had a way of humming softly while she worked, and Julian caught himself listening for it without realizing why. What disturbed him most was how comfortable she seemed around him. While other employees maintained careful distance, Sophia moved through his space as if she belonged there. She would lean over his desk to point out details and reports, stand close enough that he could catch the faint scent of her perfume, and speak to him as if he were simply another person rather than the formidable Julian Blackwood. The crisis came on a Thursday afternoon. Julian was reviewing quarterly projections when he noticed a mistake in the financial analysis that could cost the company millions if it went unnoticed to the board meeting. His hands began to shake slightly, a reaction to stress that he had never quite managed to control. "Sophia," he called through the intercom, his voice tighter than usual. "I need you in here immediately." She appeared within seconds, taking one look at his face before closing the door behind her. "What's wrong?" "There's an error in the Patterson account analysis," Julian said, his words coming faster than usual. "If this gets presented to the board tomorrow, we could lose the entire contract. I need you to call the entire finance team back in, have them work through the night if necessary." Sophia moved closer to his desk, studying the papers he was gesturing at. "Mr. Blackwood, you're hyperventilating," she said quietly. "Take a breath." "Not enough time to breathe," Julian snapped, standing abruptly and beginning to pace. "This company doesn't run on breathing. It runs on perfection, and this is the opposite of perfect." Without warning, his legs gave out slightly, the stress and lack of sleep finally catching up with him. He reached out instinctively to steady himself against the desk, but his hand missed, and he began to fall backward. Sophia moved without thinking. Her arms wrapped around him, pulling him against her to keep him from hitting the floor. For a moment, they were pressed close together, her hands flat against his back, his face mere inches from hers. Julian went completely still. For the first time in 15 years, a woman was touching him, holding him, and he wasn't pulling away. Instead of the panic and revulsion he expected, he felt something entirely different. Warmth. Comfort. A sense of safety he had forgotten existed. "Are you okay?" Sophia whispered, her brown eyes filled with genuine concern. Julian's heart was pounding, but not from fear. He could feel the softness of her blazer beneath his hands. Smell the subtle vanilla scent of her shampoo. See the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. Time seemed suspended between them.
Ow.
Then reality crashed back in. Julian jerked away so violently that he nearly fell again, his face pale and his breathing erratic. "Don't," he gasped, holding up his hands as if to ward her off. "Don't ever do that again." Sophia took a step back, her expression shifting from concern to confusion. "I'm sorry, I was just trying to help. You were about to fall." "I don't care," Julian said, his voice harsher than he intended. "There are rules, Miss Chen, boundaries that cannot be crossed." "But you were hurt," Sophia protested. "I couldn't just let you fall and hit your head." Julian turned away from her, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles were white. He couldn't explain to her that her touch had affected him in ways he didn't understand. That for those few seconds, all his carefully constructed defenses had crumbled. "The rules exist for a reason," he said finally, his voice cold and controlled once more. "They are not suggestions, they are absolute." Sophia was quiet for a long moment. She spoke. Her voice was softer than before. "Mr. Blackwood, what happened to you?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Julian spun around, his gray eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and something that looked dangerously close to vulnerability. "That is none of your concern," he said. "Your job is to assist me professionally, not to psychoanalyze me." "You're right," Sophia said, though her expression remained troubled. "I apologize for overstepping." She moved to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "you don't have to carry everything alone. Some burdens are lighter when shared." After she left, Julian sank into his chair, his hands trembling slightly. He stared at the spot where she had held him, where for just a moment the world had felt different. Safer, warmer. He had spent 15 years building walls to protect himself, and Sophia Chen had nearly demolished them with a single act of kindness that terrified him more than any business deal or corporate takeover ever could. But as he sat there in his pristine office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, Julian couldn't shake the memory of how right it had felt to be held by her. And that realization would haunt him far more than any past trauma ever had. The untouchable Julian Blackwood had been touched, and his world would never be the same. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in Julian's office, and the tension between them had become almost unbearable. Sophia continued her work with professional excellence, but she could feel Julian watching her with a mixture of wariness and something else she couldn't quite identify. He had become even more distant, if such a thing were possible. speaking to her only when absolutely necessary and maintaining at least 3 feet of distance at all times. But Sophia Chen was not easily deterred. She had grown up as the youngest of 4 children in a family where persistence was a survival skill, and she had learned to read people the way others read books. Julian Blackwood was a puzzle she was determined to solve, not out of mere curiosity, but because she genuinely cared about the man she glimpsed beneath the cold exterior. She had begun to notice things. The way his hands would tremble slightly when he was under extreme stress, how he never ate lunch, surviving on black coffee and determination. The fact that he stayed in the office until well past midnight most nights, as if he were afraid to go home to whatever waited for him there. Most telling of all were the moments when he thought no one was watching. Sophia had caught him staring out his window with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made her chest ache. Julian Blackwood had everything money could buy, but he seemed to have nothing that truly mattered. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Sophia was finishing up some reports when she heard Julian's voice echoing from his office, louder and more agitated than she had ever heard it before. She could make out fragments of what sounded like a heated phone conversation. "I don't care what the board thinks, Victoria." Julian's voice carried through the usually soundproof walls. "That was 15 years ago. You made your choice." Sophia froze. Victoria. She had heard that name mentioned in whispered conversations among longtime employees, always with a mixture of pity and understanding. Whoever Victoria was, she was connected to Julian's past in a way that still caused him pain. "No," Julian continued, his voice growing colder. "You don't get to waltz back into my life now that your senator husband is having financial troubles. I owe you nothing." There was silence for several minutes, then the sound of something crashing against the wall. Sophia was on her feet before she realized she had moved, heading toward Julian's office without stopping to think about boundaries or rules. She knocked once, then opened the door. Julian stood with his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. The remains of a crystal paperweight lay scattered across the marble floor. "Mr. Blackwood," Sophia said gently. "Are you all right?" Julian spun around, his gray eyes wild with an emotion that looked like barely controlled fury mixed with anguish. "I thought everyone had gone home." "I was finishing the Morrison contract," Sophia replied, stepping carefully around the broken glass. "Julian, what happened?" He flinched at the sound of his first name, but for once he didn't correct her. "Nothing that concerns you?" Sophia studied his face, taking in the tight lines around his eyes, the way his usually perfect hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it. "Victoria," she said quietly. Julian went very still. "What did you say?" "You're talking to someone named Victoria?" Sophia said, moving closer despite every instinct that told her to maintain distance. "Who is she?" For a moment, Julian looked as if he might explode with rage. Then, to Sophia's surprise, something in his expression crumbled. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. "She was my fiancée," he said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. 15 years ago. Sophia felt her heart skip. She had suspected there was a woman in Julian's past, but hearing him confirm it sent a strange pang through her chest. "What happened?" Julian was quiet, for so long that Sophia thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was 23, he began, staring at his hands. "Fresh out of business school, full of dreams about changing the world through technology. I had some early success with the social media app, made my first million. I thought I was invincible." He paused, and Sophia moved to the chair across from his desk, settling in to listen. She had learned that Julian needed time to find his words, and pushing him would only make him retreat further into himself. "Victoria Sterling was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen," Julian continued. "Blonde hair, blue eyes, came from old money. She was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Sophisticated, charming, connected to all the right people." Sophia felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't about her feelings. "We dated for 2 years, Julian said. I gave her everything. My time, my attention, my heart. I bought her a ring that cost more than most people make in a year. I planned this elaborate proposal on her family's yacht." His voice grew quieter, and Sophia had to strain to hear him. The night before I was going to propose, I overheard her talking to her friend on the phone. She was laughing about how naive I was, how easy it was to manipulate me. She said I was just a stepping stone, that as soon as someone better came along, she would drop me without a second thought. Sophia's heart clenched. She could only imagine how devastating that must have been for a young man in love. But that wasn't the worst part, Julian continued, his gray eyes meeting hers for the first time since he had started talking. The worst part was that she was right. The next week, she met Senator Richard Harrison at a charity gala. He was older, more established, had political connections that could advance her social status in ways my tech money never could. Julian, Sophia said softly, but he held up a hand to stop her. She broke up with me 3 days later, he said. Told me I was sweet, but that what we had wasn't real love. It was just convenience. She gave me back the ring and walked out of my life like the 2 years we had spent together meant nothing at all. Sophia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She could see the young Julian so clearly, heartbroken and betrayed by someone he had trusted completely. That was when I made the rules, Julian said, his voice growing cold again. No emotional attachments, no physical contact. No one gets close enough to hurt me like that again. The office fell silent except for the sound of rain pattering against the windows. Sophia wanted desperately to reach out to him, to offer some form of comfort. But she knew that would only send him retreating behind his walls again. She called. Tonight, Julian said finally, apparently Senator Harrison has been making some poor financial investments. I need money, and Victoria thinks she can charm me into helping them. What did you tell her? Sophia asked. Julian's smile was sharp and cold. Right. I told her exactly what she told me 15 years ago, that what we had wasn't real. It was just convenience. And now, it's not even that. Right. Sophia studied his face, seeing the satisfaction there, but also the pain that lingered beneath it. How do you feel about seeing her again after all this time? Julian was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, he said, nothing. I felt absolutely nothing when I heard her voice. For years, I thought that would be a victory. But now I'm wondering if feeling nothing is just another kind of defeat. The vulnerability in his voice made Sophia's chest ache. She could see how much it had cost him to share this story, how raw and exposed he must be feeling. Julian, she said carefully, not everyone is Victoria Sterling. His gray eyes snapped to hers, sharp and defensive, aren't they? In my experience, everyone wants something. Money, status, connections. No one gets close to someone like me without an agenda. I don't want anything from you, Sophia said quietly. Julian laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want a job? Security? A good reference for your next position? I want you to be happy, Sophia replied, the words coming out before she could stop them. Julian stared at her as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. What? Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she pressed on. I want you to be happy, she repeated. You're brilliant. You're successful. You've built something incredible with this company, but you're miserable, Julian. You work 18-hour days because you're afraid to go home to an empty apartment. You don't eat because food doesn't taste like anything when you're eating alone. You haven't touched another human being in 15 years because you're terrified of being hurt again. Julian's face had gone completely white. Stop. You deserve more than this, Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger. You deserve to trust someone. You deserve to be cared for. You deserve to feel something other than emptiness, I said. Stop, Julian said, standing abruptly. His hands were shaking again, and Sophia could see the panic beginning to build in his eyes. But she couldn't stop. Not when she could see how much pain he was carrying, how desperately he needed someone to see past his defenses. I know you felt something when I caught you that day, she said, standing as well. I know because I felt it too, that connection. That moment when you let your guard down. It was real, Julian. It was the most real thing I've ever experienced. You don't know what you're talking about, Julian said, but his voice lacked conviction, don't I? Sophia took a step closer, and Julian immediately took a step back. Then why are your hands shaking? Why won't you look at me? Why do you watch me when you think I'm not paying attention? Julian hit the wall behind his desk, literally backed into a corner. His breathing had become shallow, and Sophia could see the war being waged behind his gray eyes.
Please,
He whispered, and the word broke Sophia's heart. Please don't do this. Sophia stopped moving toward him, but she didn't back away. Do what, Julian? Care about you? 'Cause I'm afraid it's too late for that? The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and terror. Julian stared at her as if she were a wild animal that might attack at any moment. You don't understand, he said, his voice raw. I can't be what you want me to be. I'm broken, Sophia. Victoria didn't just break my heart. She broke something fundamental inside me, and I don't know how to fix it. You're not broken, Sophia said firmly. You're scared. There's a difference. There? Julian asked, and the pain in his voice made tears spring to Sophia's eyes again. Yes, she said. Broken things can't be repaired. Scared things can learn to be brave again. Julian closed his eyes, his head falling back against the wall. I don't know how. You don't have to know how, Sophia said gently. You just have to be willing to try. When Julian opened his eyes again, Sophia saw something she had never seen there before. Hope, fragile and terrified, but hope nonetheless. What if I hurt you? He asked quietly. What if you don't? Sophia countered. Julian stared at her for a long moment, and Sophia could see him weighing his options, calculating risks the way he did with business deals. Finally, he spoke. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to let someone in. We'll figure it out together, Sophia said, one step at a time. Julian nodded slowly, and Sophia felt something shift between them. The walls were still there, but for the first time, she could see cracks in the foundation. And through those cracks, she caught a glimpse of the man Julian could be if he allowed himself to heal. It would not be easy. There would be setbacks and moments of panic, times when Julian would retreat behind his defenses, and Sophia would have to be patient, enough to wait for him to emerge again. But as she stood there in his office, surrounded by the broken glass of his old life, Sophia knew with absolute certainty that Julian Blackwood was worth the wait. The weeks following, Julian's revelation about Victoria had been a delicate dance between hope and fear. Sophia had kept her word, taking things one step at a time, allowing Julian to set the pace of their slowly evolving relationship. Some days he would surprise her with small gestures of trust, like asking her opinion on personal matters or sharing stories from his childhood. Other days he would retreat so far behind his walls that Sophia wondered if she had imagined any progress at all. But she remained patient, understanding that healing 15 years of self-imposed isolation would not happen overnight. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, knowing when to push gently forward, and when to simply be present without demands. The turning point came on a Friday evening in late November. Blackwood Technologies was hosting its annual Investor Gala, a crucial event that could secure funding for Julian's newest venture into sustainable energy technology. The pressure had been mounting for weeks, and Sophia had watched Julian become increasingly tense as the date approached. She stood in her apartment, adjusting the emerald green dress she had chosen for the evening. It was elegant but not flashy. Professional yet feminine. She wanted to look perfect, not for the investors or the cameras, but for Julian. Tonight felt important in ways she couldn't fully explain. When Julian arrived to pick her up, Sophia felt her breath catch. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made his gray eyes appear almost silver in the hallway light. His dark hair was styled impeccably, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who owned the world. But Sophia could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his cufflinks. You look beautiful, he said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there months ago. Thank you, Sophia replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. You clean up pretty well yourself, Mr. Blackwood? Julian's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Shall we go face the wolves? The Grandview Hotel ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland, complete with crystalline decorations and soft lighting that made everything shimmer like ice. The city's elite moved through the space like elegant predators. Their conversations, a careful balance of business and social maneuvering. Sophia stayed close to Julian as he navigated the crowd, Watching him transform into the polished CEO that the world expected him to be, he shook hands with investors, made small talk with board members, and presented his vision for the future of renewable energy with passion and precision. But she could see the cost of maintaining his public persona, the way his jaw tightened with each forced interaction. They were midway through dinner when disaster struck. Julian was in the middle of his presentation to the room, outlining the potential returns on investment for his solar technology initiative, when a figure from his past stepped into his line of sight. Victoria Sterling Harrison stood near the back of the room, more beautiful than ever, despite being in her late 30s. Her blonde hair was swept into an elegant updo, her red dress was clearly couture, and her smile was the same practiced perfection that had once captivated a young Julian Blackwood. Sophia watched Julian's face go pale. In his words, before he recovered his composure. But the damage was done. She could see his confidence wavering, his carefully constructed presentation beginning to unravel. Without thinking, Sophia stood from her seat at the head table and moved toward the presentation area. Julian's eyes found hers across the room, and she saw panic there, a silent plea for help. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sophia said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system as she approached the microphone. "If I may add to Mr. Blackwood's presentation, I'd like to share some of the environmental impact projections that make this initiative so compelling." Julian stepped back slightly, allowing her to take the microphone, his expression shifting. From panic to gratitude, Sophia launched into a detailed explanation of the sustainability metrics, her voice confident and engaging. She had studied every aspect of Julian's business, and her passion for his vision came through in every word. As she spoke, she could see Julian's composure returning, his breathing becoming more steady. When she finished her addition to the presentation, the applause was enthusiastic, and several investors immediately approached Julian with questions and expressions of interest. But Victoria was still there, watching from the shadows with calculating eyes. The official presentation concluded successfully, with Julian securing commitments for nearly twice the funding he had hoped for. As the crowd began to disperse into smaller groups for networking, Sophia saw Victoria making her way toward them with the predatory grace of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. Julian Victoria purred as she approached, completely ignoring Sophia's presence. That was quite an impressive presentation. You always did have such vision. Julian's entire body went rigid, and Sophia could see his hands beginning to tremble slightly. The progress they had made over the past week seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by the terrified young man who had been betrayed 15 years ago. "Victoria," Julian replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Oh, Richard and I have been following your company's progress with great interest," Victoria said, moving closer to Julian. "We've been hoping for an opportunity to reconnect. Perhaps we could discuss some potential collaboration over drinks." Sophia felt a surge of protective anger. She could see exactly what Victoria was doing, using their shared history and Julian's vulnerabilities to manipulate him once again. But she also knew that Julian needed to face this moment himself, to prove to himself that he was no longer the naive young man who had been so easily deceived. "I don't think that would be appropriate," Julian said, his voice growing stronger. "As I told you on the phone, the past is the past." Victoria's smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "Julian, darling, surely you can't still be upset about something that happened so long ago. We were both young and foolish. People change." "You're right," Julian said, and Sophia felt her heart sink. People do change. But then Julian turned to look at her, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "I've changed," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I've learned that real love isn't about what someone can do for you or how they can advance your position in life. Real love is about finding someone who sees all your flaws and broken pieces and chooses to stay anyway." He reached out then, his hand finding Sophia's, with a confidence that surprised them both. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm, just as it had that first day in his office, but this time Julian didn't pull away. "Real love is about finding someone who makes you want to be brave," he said, his eyes never leaving Sophia's face. Someone who makes the risk of being hurt seem insignificant compared to the possibility of being truly happy. Victoria's perfect. Composure cracked slightly. Julian, you can't be serious. This is your assistant. This is the woman I love, Julian said simply, and Sophia felt tears spring to her eyes. The woman who has shown me more genuine kindness and understanding in a few months than I experienced in the 2 years we spent together. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that changed everything. Sophia could hardly believe what she was hearing, could hardly trust that Julian Blackwood, the man who hadn't touched another human being in 15 years, was standing here holding her hand and professing his love in front of his worst nightmare. I don't understand, Victoria said, her voice losing its sultry confidence. What does she have that I don't? Julian looked at Victoria for a long moment, and Sophia could see years of anger and hurt finally being laid to rest. She has nothing to gain from being with me except my heart, he said quietly. And apparently, that's enough for her. Victoria stared at them for another moment, and turned on her heel and disappeared into the crowd without another word. Julian turned to face Sophia fully, both of his hands now holding hers. The ballroom continued to buzz with conversation around them, but they might as well have been completely alone. I meant what I said, Julian whispered. I love you, Sophia. I'm terrified of it, and I have no idea how to do this, but I love you. Sophia felt tears streaming down her cheeks. I love you too, she whispered back. I have for weeks. I was just waiting for you to be ready to hear it. Julian lifted one hand to gently wipe away her tears, the gesture so tender that it made her heart ache. I'm still scared, he admitted. I'm probably going to panic and retreat sometimes. I'm going to need patience and understanding, and I'm going to make mistakes. We'll make mistakes together, Sophia said, reaching up to touch his face. We'll figure it out as we go. Julian leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly, as if he were savoring the sensation. When he opened them again, they were bright. With unshed tears, I never thought I would feel this way again, he said. I never thought I would want to. And now? Sophia asked. Julian smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face and made him look years younger. Now I can't. Imagine my life without you in it. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Sophia rose to meet him halfway. Their lips touched softly at first, tentative and sweet. Then, with growing passion, as 15 years of self-imposed isolation finally crumbled completely. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Julian rested his forehead against hers. So what happens now? Sophia asked. Julian's smile was soft and full of possibility. Now we go home, he said, together, and tomorrow we start building something new. As they walked out of the ballroom hand in hand, Sophia couldn't help but think about how much had changed since that first day when she had caught Julian falling. He had been so afraid of being touched, so convinced that he was broken beyond repair. But love, Sophia had learned, had a way of healing even the deepest wounds. It just required patience, understanding, and the courage to believe that some risks were worth taking. Julian Blackwood had spent 15 years building walls to protect himself from being hurt again. Tonight, he had finally found the strength to tear them down. And in their place, he and Sophia would build something far more beautiful. A life filled with love, trust, and the kind of happiness that came from truly knowing and being known by another person. The untouchable heart had finally learned to love again, and it was more magnificent than either of them had ever dared to imagine.